I'm Phil Eskew, a family physician and attorney. I practice in Wyoming. I finished residency in Pennsylvania in 2015 and immediately opted out of Medicare and started doing DPC in a rather unusual setting, which is mostly correctional medicine and occasionally on-site with an employer. Thank you, Jenny, for the introduction. Thank you to Jeremy and Marilyn for putting on such a great conference. So what are we going to talk about today? Since I have the attorney background, everybody always wants me to talk about the legal issues. So that's what we're going to spend most of our time on. Why do we feel the need to define direct primary care in the first place? You've heard lots of what it is during this conference. The reason we defined it was because state insurance commissioners were coming after DPC physicians. So we'll get into several examples of that. We had to define ourselves so that we could prove we weren't insurance, which seems rather obvious to everyone in this room, but it's not always obvious to a regulator. So we're also going to look at the HITECH Act because it's one of the fun ways, whether DPC or otherwise, that you can use to sort of force price transparency out of the rest of the health system. And then we're going to look at various conflicts of interest that might occur along the way, whether you're traditional medicine or even DPC. How do we define direct primary care? You're charging a periodic fee that's usually on a monthly basis. You're not doing any third-party fee-for-service billing, so I call that the no double-dipping prohibition. That's the biggest difference between DPC and traditional concierge practices. Concierge practices keep taking insurance, they keep everybody on the hamster wheel, and they charge more from people who can pay more to give them a little more time. In DPC, we don't have to discriminate from one patient to the other based on exactly how much they're paying us. We get to give everybody that same level of care. The third part there is what confuses people the most. The concept is, if you have a DPC practice and you're charging patients $50 a month and then you're charging them $100 a visit, that doesn't really incentivize ongoing care the way we would like. So that's more of a cash pay urgent care model. I have no problem with that model. It's not something I object to. But that kind of model does not get the attention from the insurance commissioner because that per visit fee is high enough that they don't fear overutilization. So not insurance stances. They're going to be, the next slide's going to have 30 different states that have a different shade. We're going to go over those in a second. But 23 states have very clear, they're in the green on the next one, they're clearly not insurance. They've made an attempt in Arizona that we'll dig into. Oregon is one of the few states that still has a law that was probably more harmful than helpful. And then we've got some regulatory guidance in 5 states also. And then I'm going to do a comparison with DPC and health sharing ministries, because health sharing ministries fought this battle before we did, and I think it was probably harder for them than us. So here's what it looks like right now. Everybody who's in green has an explicit law that says if you do XYZ, we're going to define you as direct primary care and you're not insurance, and you don't have to debate this with the insurance commissioner or anybody else. In 2012, I think we had 5. So we've made a whole lot of progress, and a lot of it's been very recent. In the purple states, we've got good insurance commissioner guidance on the books, and that represents a reversal in Maryland because they used to have harsher guidance and now they have good guidance. Oregon and Arizona we'll talk about in a second. If you're in a state that's not shaded at all, it's also generally safe to do this. You just have to be a little more careful in how you write your contract from day one. We have DPC practices in 48 states plus DC. The only ones without an office are the Dakotas, which I think is just a function of fewer people living there. So my favorite example, I'm biased, is Wyoming. That's our entire DPC law. That slide. That's it. All of it. And I bolded the spots that I think are the most important, and I'm just sort of going to mention them to you now. Either party can terminate the agreement at any point without penalty or any termination fee. You're going to describe your health services, which is your scope, so they know what they're getting for the monthly fee. You're going to tell them what that monthly fee is. You're not going to double dip. And then you're going to disclose specifically that this is not health insurance. These are all fairly easy things to do, and they should be in anybody's DPC contract, whether you have law on the books or not. And you compare that with what Oregon did, which was much earlier in the process. They were actually the 3rd state to have a DPC law. First off, they failed to explicitly state it wasn't insurance, which is an obvious and terrible mistake. They looked at Washington next door and for some reason did not model their law after theirs. They failed to distinguish between DPC and concierge practices and bundled them into this group retainer category. What did Arizona do? They tried to pass a law that they thought was helpful, but there was a poison pill slipped in there, and that poison pill is in red. So they said DPC is not insurance if the plan does not assume financial risk, which was the entire debate in the first place. And then they didn't carefully define direct primary care either. A few years later, they came back and added this other subpart beneath there, which really didn't help things either, since it defined DPC as being on a prepaid basis, which is usually wrong. We usually bill after the fact, usually to appease insurance commissioners, which would prefer that you bill at the end of the month. And then they also threw board certification into the mix, which is a total mistake. They're the only state that's done that. What happened in Maryland? In 2009, a group of 5 physicians started to run a DPC practice. They'd seen a few folks nearby doing this, and it just so happened one of their patients was a cousin, had some sort of relation to the state insurance commissioner. She gets the letter saying the practice is converting to DPC, goes to the insurance commissioner. Insurance commissioner does not like this and writes guidelines that were rather threatening to their operation. And those are the 2009 guidelines there. They're not fatal, but they were a little bit problematic. And that's there as a reference for everyone. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because this is already dated. We've got a new insurance commissioner in Maryland now, and in 2015, there was a dental case that actually came before them. This dental office was selling a premium plus dental plan. And they said it will work similar to many dental plans on the market. You pay a monthly membership fee for benefit coverage, mistake, on your dental expenses. All questions regarding plan coverage, blah, 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 blah. It sounds like an insurance contract already. And then they said offers excellent coverage for major dental procedures like crowns, root canals, bridges, and procedures. And of course, this got the unwanted attention from the insurance commissioner, so they had to tell them, you're not doing this the right way. And the revised guidance was a little better and reflected some of the work that I think we've done in other states. In Massachusetts, the insurance commissioner wrote a letter clarifying what may or may not be problematic for DPC practices. And this was mostly helpful. I had a few areas in red for those who might be here from Massachusetts today. You need to disclose several different things. So most states have some sort of disclosure where you have to say it's not insurance. Massachusetts, you have to go a little bit further. You have to say it's not a health benefit plan, doesn't satisfy MEC standards for health insurance, and you even have to talk about open enrollment windows, which I thought was rather tacky. And then the worst part there, services provided by the DPC practice may be covered by your insurance plan as well. That's not our problem. That's the insurance plan's problem, and we should not have to bring that up every time we talk to somebody. So this could be better, but at least they do have guidance saying that they're not going to come after you if you put these disclosures in there, and that's a fairly easy thing to do. What happened in South Carolina? They also have an insurance commissioner letter. And there they said, we want you to take payment at the end of the month, which is a common practice for most DPC operations. If you want payment at the beginning, because you're worried a patient's going to join, you're going to do a lot of upfront work and quit, then you charge an enrollment fee, which is clearly non-refundable. Other than that, it's safest to bill in arrears so you don't get that unwanted attention, and you never, quite frankly, have to deal with a refund or any kind of arguments about that when the patient leaves the practice. If you get in, that's usually not worth your trouble. It can result in medical board complaints and more hassles you don't want to deal with. So in South Carolina, they did want you to indeed pay in arrears, which is the preference in most states. And they said, really, what you've described to us does not sound like risk transfer, which is the foundation of this threat and argument in the first place. And notably there, in number 5 is what I want everybody to focus on. It's sort of the most important thing here, especially as DPC practices grow. More and more outside the box, so to speak, insurance groups are taking note of direct primary care. I think Josh found Allied National. There are lots of others that promote it, and they do various level funded plans with employers, any number of complicated arrangements, and they often promote DPC because it makes them look good. Now, if they promote it on their own, you're fine. If you get into some sort of arrangement with them where you're trying to compensate them to be a salesman for you, you're going to get in trouble. Rather, it's a state like South Carolina that says, look, you've done all this work to say you're not insurance, and now you have an insurance salesman who works for you. That looks bad. To whatever your state's fee-splitting law might be, if it looks like, in general, physicians cannot split fees with non-physicians, and if you're doing that, you're going to be in trouble there too. What did the Illinois Insurance Commissioner say? This was actually pretty cool. I would encourage, we could try this with local AAPS state chapters maybe, or if your local AAFP chapter is friendly, you could do this. In Illinois, their AFP chapter wanted to get more DPC physicians in the state because they liked the idea, And they didn't have a practice that wanted to stick their neck out there, but they had a little bit of funds of their own. So they talked to local legal counsel, and then they went to the Illinois Insurance Commissioner and said, we've sort of thrown you an example contract. What do you think about this? And they wrote back a simple letter that said, yeah, sure, no problem. So where you didn't used to have guidance, suddenly you do when you get an insurance commissioner that will play ball. Some talk and some don't. Montana was interesting. They're the only state that has passed DPC legislation twice, the second effort much better than the first, both of which were vetoed by a clueless governor. In other states, it's been bipartisan. We've had states that are entirely Democrat legislature and governor sign bills, but the Democrat governor in Montana was confused by this, and since it was passed by Republicans, I think he instinctively vetoed it. And what happened was Montana is one of the few states where the insurance commissioner is not appointed, instead he's elected. So here, even though the governor didn't like it, even though he's vetoed it twice, they've got an insurance commissioner who was formerly in their state legislature promoting this bill. Well, now he got himself elected insurance commissioner. So guess what he did? He issued his own guidance and actually referenced some of our work at the Coalition and DPC Frontier in the process is cited in his guidance. So that's been pretty cool. And he just borrowed our definition and said, there it is. He says, written agreements which meet these criteria and clearly outline the DPC services are not insurance products. And then went on to say, if you're varying from this, that's fine. You might want to be careful about that. Make sure you're not an HMO, which is the same thing we tell people. And then went a little further and said, tell you what, if you're really concerned, go ahead and send me your contract and we'll look at it and sort of give you thoughts in advance. So it's refreshing to have that approach to this. It's refreshing to have people pay attention to it. He's not the first insurance commissioner to campaign on this. There was actually a libertarian insurance commissioner in Georgia who I think got 5% of the vote or so. But he did campaign on it previously too. So here's the comparison point. There was a recent paper, and I'm blanking. I've got the citation in my notes, but this was an excellent study that was done of health sharing ministries recently, and they looked at which states had actually explicitly passed laws. So health sharing ministries had to fight to become legal in every state as well, often through the court system. But only the orange ones passed explicit laws stating they weren't insurance. And
they were or weren't?
They passed it, that they are not insurance.
They are not insurance.
Yeah, the orange ones are clearly not insurance. The blue ones got there indirectly because you can buy these across the country now. And we compare that map to what we have in DPC, it's fairly similar, but there are a few outliers that I thought are worth pointing out here. So we've got some states that have health shares that say they're not insurance, but they don't comment on DPC, and I think those are ripe for legislation, maybe more than others. Kim Corba's been pushing things in Pennsylvania more than anybody else I know, that's for sure. And
it's on ice right now.
Yeah, that's been a hard push. But some of the other states listed here should be possible as well. Alaska, they've had a couple small attempts, really haven't got much traction. There have been attempts at various levels in Hawaii, California, Wisconsin, New York, Vermont, Massachusetts, New Jersey. I think there were a few talks in maybe Minnesota as well. I think Twyla was pushing things there. But there really hasn't been a discussion in Nevada, New Mexico, North Dakota, Ohio, New Hampshire, Delaware, Rhode Island. So if you can go to the legislature, great. If you can't, you could always go to the insurance commissioner and try to get some guidance. But either way, I think just like the health shares, we're at a tipping point. You know, we're getting a majority, and that's what we wanted. And at that point, you've got good precedent on your side. So what's my prediction? I think we'll probably wind up somewhere north of 30, maybe closer to 40 states that have guidance either through the legislature or an insurance commissioner. And at some point, I think even traditional health insurance is just going to sort of run away. I think we're going to wind up with more and more health shares. We're going to wind up with more MEWA plans since Trump has been changing things there. And it's literally been regulated to death. And that's probably the easiest way to let it die. Just get rid of it. Because the court's not going to fix it. Nobody's going to vote it out. But if we just abandon it as something left in the rubble, then that's fine. Okay, so where are we at with HITECH? HITECH was a modification of HIPAA. And it says that if a patient wants you, whether you're DPC, whether you're still in the system, even if you didn't want to play ball, if they want you to privately bill them to keep their records private, they're allowed to do that. So remember, under HIPAA, the P in HIPAA is for portability, not privacy. And the main portability clauses under HIPAA are TP and O, treatment, payment, operations. So if I'm involved in some, with some hospital system, with some insurance company, the minute you come in, whether you sign that agreement or not, the standard HIPAA forms, I'm allowed to share your information on that basis. If somebody else is paying your bills, they want your information, they get it. So if you want to keep that private, the government, somebody told them, and they found that to be a problem. So in HITECH, you're allowed to privately pay, and by privately paying, now you don't have that payment exception under HIPAA, and your information is indeed more private. Making sure it stays private is a little tricky, but you're allowed to request it. And when you do request it, they have to offer you a price because you're the one paying the bill. If you're under Medicare, you're allowed to do this. They specifically exempted it. Since the HITECH provision unfortunately had a castration clause, which we'll get into in a minute, but Medicare you can do it as well. And of course, HITECH's going to trump any private insurance contract, which is where this is the most fun. So the covered entity must agree to the requested restriction unless the disclosure is otherwise required by law. The main places it's otherwise going to be required is under Medicaid, unfortunately. This usually isn't open to Medicaid patients. And potentially certain state HMO laws, but usually not. So, okay, next slide. If a provider is required by state or other law to submit a claim, and there is no exception or procedure for individuals wishing to pay out of pocket for the service, then the disclosure is required by law. So this is the castration clause that's unfortunately in there. Medicare went on to say, we're going to pay attention to that, and we're going to give you an exception. So if you have a Medicare patient come in and they want to pay privately because they don't want this information to go to Medicare or their Medicaid managed care plan, then you're allowed to have them pay privately. So a lot of people see this and they get really excited and they say, wait a minute, now I don't have to opt out. Now I can just do this and have everybody pay me privately. And to that I say it's a bad idea. Why is it a bad idea? Because you still have to code to defend what you're doing, and you still have to charge them the same price you would have charged Medicare. Medicare can still come in and audit you to make sure you generally did that appropriately. So I don't think it's exciting, not from a DPC standpoint. It's probably more exciting from a DPC patient standpoint as they go throughout the rest of the system and maybe try and force transparency on the system, which is what we've been doing all along. But this is not something I would build my practice around. And it's also a little bit hard, even if you advertise based on privacy purposes, to argue that every single one of your patients was demanding privacy and separately signed this contract and wanted to pay you privately. Okay, so implementation, you want to have the patient sign a request that says that they wanted these things to be private. That way you can defend it if the insurer or whoever would try to argue otherwise. And you have to flag the information so that you don't accidentally share it later, right? Because you get all these requests all the time and you're sending out medical records here, there, and everywhere. This information needs to be in a separate pile, maybe a separate EMR, maybe a separate box, however you do it. I think psychiatry is probably used to doing that more than most traditional practices. So we need to get the hang of this at the rest of the healthcare system as well. When you send the patient to the pharmacy with a prescription, I don't know how you do that in the state of New York with this law, because New York requires you to send those electronically. And when you send it electronically, that pharmacy is instinctively going to run it through the plan, which means you violated this clause. So I don't have an answer for that unless you can somehow flag that electronic note or maybe call them beforehand and fax them a letter and we'll document it. But traditionally what you would do is you'd give them a paper prescription and the patient would show up at the pharmacist and make the same demand with them that they just made at your office. So in summary, all covered entities must have a process for dealing with HITECH. The refusal should be of the patient's own free will. Medicare, there's the exception we talked about. Limiting charges still apply. In Medicaid, you can't really do it. And then also in Kentucky and Colorado, you should note that those states, people should maybe be building a constitutional case because it doesn't matter if you've contracted with Medicaid or not. They prohibit you from privately contracting with Medicaid patients, period. So the only way I know to see a Colorado Medicaid patient under a private contract is to put your office right next door in Wyoming. So,
are you selling real estate?
Yeah. So HMO laws are state-based. Private insurance contracts are obviously defeated by this, and they can kick and scream all they want. It won't matter. Okay, opt-out implications. I think I already kind of covered this. This should not be a panacea for those who are debating not opting out and building their practice around this model. So third-party conflicts of interest. You've got your traditional ones at the top. PBMs we've spoken about several times at the conference already. Pharmacy benefit managers, those guys make a living being middlemen and inflating costs and hiding everything along the way. There's really no role for them in our system, and the quicker they fall, the better everybody will be. Pharmaceutical companies can similarly be problematic. I've got an example of that, and that's in the traditional system, but certainly can be a problem in DPC as well, largely through their misinformation and various marketing campaigns. Especially labs can sometimes get folks in trouble. We all know about insurance companies, the BUCAs, that's how they're abbreviated these days, HMOs. When it comes to DPC, there can still be some conflicts, and they're related to payment in some places and in sometimes not. So lots of groups want to adopt DPC, and they want to adopt it quickly when they realize what it is, and they're used to paying for care. This could be the patient's grandma, it could be the patient's employer, it could be a variety of parties, and you have to decide how that's going to work. Healthcare sharing ministries have wanted to sometimes pay the monthly fee, and that didn't always go over well either. And even some HMOs are trying to adopt this. So what happened with what's a traditional conflict of interest study? One of my favorites, which I heard about at a correctional medicine conference, was Gabapentin. I don't know how many people were privy to this massive marketing campaign. I think it predates me. But the FDA really has two indications for this medication. And think of how many things we use it for. It's supposed to be for post-herpetic neuralgia and partial seizures and only as an adjunct. Now, I'm not a neurologist, but I don't see very many of them using gabapentin either. I don't think it's a great seizure drug. The bioavailability is fairly poor. At 900 milligrams, that's a daily dose, you're getting 60%. By the time you're up to 4,800, it's down to 25%. So these escalating doses that they promoted that you could just take through the roof, patient's not really absorbing much more of them, and you're getting more of a euphoric effect than a therapeutic one. I'm going to get some stats here, I have that ready. May 13, 2004, they'd been exposed for some fraudulent issues. So they paid over $1 billion in fines for falsely marketing gabapentin. And it's the maximum dose you should probably be going to is more like 1,800 milligrams a day. They promoted it much higher. They promoted it for mainly off-label uses. It's not any more beneficial really for chronic pain than duloxetine and other drugs that are less commonly abused. And then the next slide here was kind of fascinating. I'll just let you read this quote. I may focus on the part at the bottom there. But this is one of the guys who was a higher up in the company talking about the medication and how they marketed it. So that's where we need to be, holding their hand and whispering in their ear, Neurontin for pain, Neurontin for monotherapy, Neurontin for bipolar, Neurontin for everything. I don't want to see a single patient coming off Neurontin before they've been up to 4,800 milligrams a day. I don't want to hear that safety crap either. Have you tried Neurontin? Every one of you should take one just to see. There is nothing. It's a great drug. So are we selling healthcare or are we selling addiction? So you got to be careful and read the studies and don't listen to the marketers. Pharmacy benefit managers, they get in the way in many ways. There's a lack of price transparency about how and when they're paid and who they're paid by. The same thing for large brokers. If you're dealing with health employers that are purchasing a DPC for their patients on site. Kickbacks, they get these all over the place. They call them rebates. That sounds nicer than kickback. The anti-kickback laws don't apply to these guys. We're working on that. There's a meeting in D.C. Later this month on this issue. They own their own mail-order pharmacies. I'm blanking on his name. I've got it linked on DPC Frontier, but there's a pharmacist who's a member of Congress. I think he's from Georgia, somewhere down south. And he talked about some local pharmacists that had patients come into their pharmacy, attempt to fill a prescription, were told it wasn't approved, and then before they can walk out the door, they get a call on their cell phone that says, yeah, we can't approve that at the local pharmacy, but we'll approve it through our mail order pharmacy. And it's the one the PBM owns, where they get a higher kickback. So it's messed up in every way that it could be. And the more you can bypass them, do it. In DPC, we do it all the time because we dispense medications. So not only are we often bypassing the PBMs, we're bypassing the entire pharmacy system. We can only do that in 44 states, unfortunately, because of the pharmacy lobby in certain places, but we're working on that too. The big three bad guys there are at the bottom: CVS, Caremark, Express Scripts, and OptumRx. And for anybody who happens to be a multimillionaire looking for ways to invest in DPC, sometimes I tell them it's probably best that you don't try and buy up a bunch of clinics. Let the docs run the clinics. They know what they're doing. If you want to invest in DPC, sell those guys short, the ones at the bottom, because they've got nowhere to go but down. So what if the patient is not paying the monthly DPC fee? What do you do? Does this create a conflict of interest? Sometimes it can. And that's part of what, that's why we all want direct pay, whether it be a monthly fee or otherwise, is that you want the patient to be paying the bills. But that's not always going to be the case. There are various exceptions to that. So were they still able to select you? Were there other physicians among your practice or maybe in your area? So places where I think DPC is working best is actually where they have more practices. Colorado, Arizona, Texas. There are tons of practices to choose from. A lot of places in the country, there's only one, and it might be 50 or 60 miles away, and maybe that doc doesn't match you that well, but that's all you've got. So that's a harder situation. And the whole point here, the sort of theme of this slide, which I've used in other talks, my favorite analogy is that DPC is a selected marriage, and old-style capitation was an arranged marriage. So if you have someone else paying the monthly fee, you need to make sure you do things to keep this a selected marriage rather than an arranged one. So what about old capitation conflicts of interest? How is DPC not capitation? Well, apart from the analogy I just made, various things happen when you move from capitation to DPC. Some of these conflicts get crossed out. So you still have to be careful on a few of them. Now both you and the patient have incentives for you to do too much. Some DPC physicians have been asked to do in-office cholecystectomies. That's a bad idea. But yeah, only once? Okay. Because now they've paid you a monthly fee, right? And they want you to do as much as you can for them. So this will push your envelope in the other direction, whereas in fee-for-service, they often want you to just refer them to the dermatologist because they assume you're too incompetent to do XYZ, because that's what we've let them assume when we do 5-minute visits and never talk with the patient. I'm going to address the avoidance of sick patients, the idea that we're cherry picking. It's totally false. If you get on any of the DPC message boards, you'll see that pretty quick. We don't have lots of healthy 35-year-olds knocking on our doors, desperate to pay a monthly fee when they're not on any medications. I tell you who does see the healthy 35-year-olds, though. It's the urgent care exchange for their viral illnesses, and they're overcharging them and their insurance companies. These are the true cherry pickers. They prefer younger patients with simple complaints. The minute they get the older patient with the lightheadedness and low back pain, no, not that. Off you go, and they send you somewhere else. Whether it's their family doc, whether it's the ER, and really they charge them in the process for not giving them much helpful information. I think the urgent care chains also do the younger population of this service of this country kind of a disservice because they get the impression that's what healthcare is. And I tell them if they want to know what real healthcare is, they need to go with their grandma to her appointment and go through all those issues, and rather than assuming that this medicine is as easy as what they see in the urgent care. So hospital-owned practices, they can certainly cherry pick as well. They limit their patients to 1 or 2 complaints. That third door handle question could be chest pain, oh well. And then they want you to refer as much as possible, and by limiting your time with the patient, they ensure that you do refer within their system, and they get to see 4 or 5 doctors rather than 1. What are some other laws that can crop up and cause problems? Ironically, the corporate practice of medicine can be a problem for DPC and a lot of smaller practices. So remember why this was drafted. I mean, I don't know the exact age of these provisions, but the whole concept was physicians should be physicians and nobody should tell us how to do our job. That was the idea behind corporate practice of medicine, behind corporate practice of law, Any number of professions have these provisions in place. And it's not what's happened. What's happened is it's used to prevent us from growing our own practices, and they've made exceptions for the exact people they should have never made an exception for. North Carolina is known for having some of the toughest CPOM laws in the country. Guess who they accept? HMOs, hospitals. Those are the two groups in that law that can tell you exactly what to do. But you can't have a management company located out of state that's just doing a little bit of admin work for you and leaving the rest to yourself. Nope, that'll get you in trouble. So those laws have been perturbed in the wrong way, and I kind of wish more states would go back to what Ohio did, where they just get rid of them, because they're protecting the entities that they shouldn't protect rather than protecting physicians. Fee splitting, if you're in a variety of professions, including law or medicine, then you can't split your fees except with other professionals. So in a traditional practice, to the extent it happens, it's a little more hidden, and in DPC it's a little more tempting to wind up fee splitting, especially with a marketer or somebody else who you think might grow your practice. You might want to say to them, I tell you what, help me get more patients. As new patients come in, if they say that you were the source, then I'll give you 5% of that monthly fee. Well, now you're fee splitting. So don't do that. If you want to pay somebody to market, find a more creative way to do it where you're not giving them a clear percentage of your monthly fee. And then the whole right to medical care has been discussed multiple times at our conference. And I just wanted to point out, I'm not going to get in the ethical debate there. I think I land with most people in this room in saying the right to care will be a right to slavery. But there are two exceptions you should note. EMTALA, the Emergency Medicine Treatment and Active Labor Act, you are entitled in the United States to a current limited screening, but that can be by a nurse. You're not entitled to care per se. It's just an emergency screening, and that's all the ER ever has to give you, even though they do much more because they get uncompensated care payments from various government entities. And then the other place you get it, where I spend some of my time, is in the correctional setting under the 8th Amendment, since it would be cruel and unusual punishment to not have it. And happy to take questions. There's my email and my Twitter handle.